Hi, everyone. So, what I really want you to take away from this week are the following two things. First, the concept of an argument that matters for us. And second, the two different ways that we evaluate how good arguments are. So, these are topics which we will return to throughout the class. And furthermore, of the two ways of evaluating arguments, there is on the one hand the deductive way, so you wonder whether the argument is deductively valid, and the second has to do with induction, so you wonder about how probable the premises of the argument make the conclusion. So in particular, next week and in Unit 2, which will begin next week, we will be looking in detail at the idea of deductive validity, and we'll be using formal tools from logic to capture deductive validity. And then after doing that, in the Unit 3, we'll talk about the other way in which arguments can be good or bad, which has to do with induction. So the purpose of today's lecture is to make you familiar with the concept of deductive validity, or as we'll see, logical entailment, before we begin applying formal tools to capture it. So when we talk about logical entailment, we're talking about assessing deductive arguments. So some arguments are deductive in that they're intended to be deductively valid. So as we've seen yesterday, and as will become clear, especially in Unit 3, there are many arguments that are not intended to be deductively valid. These are arguments which rely on induction or probability, okay? And the tools of, or thinking about logical entailment do not apply to assessing those arguments. But nonetheless, there are some arguments which are intended to be deductively valid, and those are deductive arguments. And a deductive argument is good when it is in fact deductively valid. And what does that mean? Well, for an argument to be deductively valid is for its premises to entail or logically entail its conclusion. Now, what is entailment? What it means for the premises to entail the conclusion is that if the premises are true, then there is absolutely no possible way the conclusion could be false. So in this lecture, we'll be working through many examples of arguments and wondering and determining whether in fact they are deductively valid. So here is the first example. This argument is a simple argument with a single premise and a conclusion. And so the first premise is that Alice is my friend. And we conclude from that Alice would not murder me in cold blood. So I want you to ask yourself, does this premise that Alice is my friend, does it guarantee the truth of the conclusion? So another way of putting this is that, does the fact that Alice is my friend guarantee that Alice would not murder me in cold blood? And hopefully you can see that in this case, the premise does not logically guarantee the conclusion, because it's possible that Alice could be my friend, yet Alice still go about murdering me. So we can, for instance, it's possible, for instance, to have fake friends, or for there to be evil people who are a friend and then do something to us. So just because someone is your friend doesn't guarantee that they're not going to murder you in cold blood. Okay, and because of that possibility of having a friend who does that to you, this premise that Alice is my friend does not entail the conclusion. So this argument is not a deductively valid argument. Here's another example. Premise 1, Bart told a lie. Conclusion, so Bart did something wrong. Does this premise logically entail the conclusion? Well, this premise only logically entails a conclusion if it's not ever possible for a lie to be okay. But many people think that perhaps there's possible cases in which it's okay to lie. And because it's therefore possible for a lie to be okay, i.e. not wrong, the mere fact that Bart told a lie does not logically entail that he did something wrong. So in this case as well, we see that this premise that Bart told a lie does not logically entail the conclusion that he did something wrong. And therefore, this argument, which has as a premise that Bart told a lie and a conclusion that Bart did something wrong, is not deductively valid. Here's a trickier example. And this is trickier because we have, instead of one premise, we have an argument with 4 premises. So the first premise is that Alice is to my left. Second, Bob is to Alice's left. Third, Christine is to Bob's left. And finally, Danny is to Christine's left. So suppose these 4 things are true. Now, does it follow that Danny is to my left? Here's one reason why you might think it does. When you imagine the truth of all of these 4 claims, what you imagine is a line of people. So I'm standing in the middle, and then to my left is Alice, and then to Alice's left is Bob, and then to to Bob's left is Christine, and to Christine's left is Danny. And so if you imagine a line of people starting with me, and they're going to Alice and Bob and Christine and Danny, each to their left, then in that case, it seems that Danny is to my left. However, if you only think about that situation, you might think that this is a logically valid argument. However, it's not, because there is a possible situation in which all of these sentences are true, all of these premises are true, but the conclusion is not true. And the possible situation is that these 4 people, or these 5 people, including myself, are standing in a circle. So because there's a possible situation in which all of these 4 people, these 5 people, are standing in a circle, in that case, all of these claims are true as the premises, but it's not true that Danny is to my left. In fact, Danny is to my right, because we're all standing in a circle facing each other. So it's important to wonder, when we're determining whether an argument is deductively valid, it's important that we consider all the possible cases in which all the premises are true, and then we see whether in all those cases the conclusion is also true. So again, for an argument to be valid, it's on the supposition that all the premises are true, it must be the case that the conclusion is. Here's another example. Premise 1, Tweety is a bird. Conclusion, Tweety has wings. Is this a deductively valid argument? The answer is that this is not a deductively valid argument, because it's possible for there to be birds that do not have wings. So in our world, lots of flightless birds, like ostriches, still do have wings, but nonetheless, surely it's possible for one to, for instance, tear the wings off a bird. And if a bird, therefore, were to lose its wings, that's a possible case in which there's a bird without wings. So just because something is a bird does not guarantee or logically guarantee that it has wings. So this argument is not deductively valid. Here's another case we'll look at. Does the premise of this argument, that Fido is a dog, does it logically guarantee the conclusion, which is that Fido is smaller than most cows. Now, again, this argument is not logically valid. The truth of the premise that this thing, Fido is a dog, does not logically guarantee that he is smaller than most cows. So, in our world, as we understand it, it is true that most, if not all, dogs are smaller than cows. However, if this premise is to actually logically entail the conclusion, it cannot be possible for there to be any dog that's smaller than most cows. But hopefully you can see how it's a possibility, it's a logical possibility that there are dogs that are larger than most cows. So therefore, again, this argument is not deductively valid because the premise does not guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Here's another example. This is a simple argument with one premise and a conclusion. Now, the premise is that that object is my car. Okay, so there's something in front of me right now, which is my car. And so given that this thing in front of me is my car, I infer the conclusion that the object has wheels. Now, does the truth of the premise, if we suppose the premise is true, does that logically guarantee that the conclusion is true? I.e., does something being a car logically guarantee that it has wheels? Another way of putting it is that, is it possible for there to be something that is a car but does not have wheels? And with a little imagination and reflection, we can see that it is, of course, entirely possible for there to be something that is a car and does not have wheels. So in this picture, here's a car that is in a factory, okay, and this thing here is definitely a car, but it does not have wheels. So this case here shows us how it's possible for the premise to be true, but the conclusion not be, and therefore this argument is not deductively valid. So to summarize, what deductive validity or logical entailment consists of is the claim that if the premises were true, then the conclusion has to be true. Now, it's very important that you recognize the conditional aspect of this notion. So validity does not require that the premises are in fact true. It also doesn't require that the conclusion is in fact true. Okay, so the truth or falsity of the premises or the conclusion are not relevant for the validity of an argument. What matters for whether an argument is valid is that only that if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be. So what you do to determine validity is you can pretend you know all the premises are true, okay? But also it's important that you don't import any other information or background knowledge. So all you do is assume that the premises are true and assume nothing more. And then you ask yourself, on those assumptions, is the truth of the conclusion logically guaranteed? Okay. So again, validity means that if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be. So to determine validity, we pretend we know the premises are true. And we make sure we don't secretly import any other information or assumptions. And then we wonder whether the conclusion has to be as well. Okay, so that is the kind of main intuitive technique to help identify deductive validity. Now, in the rest of this lecture, and also starting next week, we're going to be looking at other methods of determining validity, okay? So the one we've looked at so far is taking the argument step by step. We're going to look at in a moment this method of flipping the argument. Okay. I'm also going to mention how it's important that we decouple our prior beliefs in the premises and conclusion when we're assessing validity. Because again, validity does not have to do with whether the premises are true. Rather, validity has to do with whether if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be. Okay? So it's therefore when we're determining validity, it's therefore important that we decouple what we're doing from our prior beliefs. And finally, and this will become especially important starting next week, is that we can, to determine whether an argument is deductively valid, we can check if the form is valid. And then, but the thing is, in order to determine the form of an argument, we need to have the tools of formal logic. So that is why, starting next week, we're going to be diving into formal logic. And this will help us understand or get a stronger grip on validity. Okay. But nonetheless, we can still talk about validity at a more intuitive level, because I think it's important that you get a strong grasp on what validity is before we bring in the formal tools. So here's another way of intuitively determining the validity of an argument. So in the examples earlier, we supposed that the premises were true, and then we wondered whether the conclusion had to follow. But there's another way of assessing it, which involves flipping the argument. And this other way of assessing validity is that what we do is we suppose the conclusion is false, and then we ask whether the premises could possibly all be true. Okay, so to recall from the very beginning of this lecture, what it means for the premises to entail the conclusion, or what it means for an argument to be logically valid, is for it to be true that if the premises were true, then the conclusion also has to be true. So we can flip that around and we can say that what it means for an argument to be valid is that if the conclusion is false, then at least one of the premises has to also be false. Okay, and because of that equivalence, which will hopefully make more sense as things develop, we can determine whether an argument is valid by first supposing the conclusion is false, and then seeing whether all the premises can be true. And if we can suppose the conclusion false and also suppose all the premises true, then we know the argument is not deductively valid. Okay, so here is in a bit more detail how to flip the argument. So the first step is we suppose the conclusion is false. And the second step is we then ask whether in that case the premises could possibly all be true. And if yes, so if it is possible for all the premises to be true when the conclusion is false, then we know the argument is invalid, because we then know that it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false, which is to say that we know that the premises do not guarantee the conclusion. But if we suppose the conclusion is false, and if we find out in that case that we cannot have all the premises be true, then we know the argument is valid. We then know the premises entail the conclusion. So let's return to an example from before. So the example argument was, had the premise that that object is my car, and the conclusion that that object has wheels. So what we do to assess the validity using the technique of flipping the argument is that what we do is we first suppose that this object does not have wheels. Okay, so we suppose that something does not have any wheels. And then we ask ourselves, is it possible for it to be true that this thing is a car. Okay, so on the assumption that this thing does not have wheels, is it possible for it to be true that it's a car? So if the object does not have wheels, could the premise be true? And the answer to this question is that it is possible for something to not have wheels and be a car, which is to say that it's possible for something to be a car and not have wheels. And we saw the example earlier of a car in a factory that did not have wheels. So the next topic is that decoupling really matters when we are determining the validity of an argument. And the reason, so decoupling is something we talked about last week as how we bring to bear our prior beliefs when we're assessing new evidence. Okay, and when we're assessing the validity of an argument, so how good an argument is that someone has given us, when we're simply assessing the validity of the argument, the actual truth of the premises or the conclusion is not relevant. So if we happen to believe the premises and conclusion, we can't let that make us think the argument is valid when it's not. So here's an example. Here is an argument with two premises. The first premise is that all beautiful things are elegant. The second premise is that all roses are elegant. And the conclusion is that all roses are beautiful. Now, at first sight, this actually looks like a pretty good argument. However, this argument is not deductively valid. So on the assumption that all beautiful things are elegant and all roses are elegant, it does not follow that all roses are beautiful. Because here in the premises, we're simply saying that beautiful things and roses are each of themselves elegant. But that doesn't mean that roses have to be beautiful. So it's possible for these premises to be true. It's possible for all beautiful things to be elegant and all roses to be elegant. But nonetheless, it's possible for roses to not be beautiful, because it's not the case that all elegant things share all their other properties. So if we consider another argument which has the exact same form, but in which the conclusion is not plausible as it is in this one, we realize that this argument type is a bad argument type. So in this argument, the first premise is that all cats are mammals. Second premise is that all dogs are mammals, but we cannot infer logically from that all cats are dogs, okay? Because cats and dogs are two different types of mammals, and that doesn't mean that they're the same type of mammals, because there can be different types of mammals. And similarly, just because there are two different types of elegant things doesn't mean that those are the same type of thing. And we can get this idea that the form is what matters for deductive validity by, instead of using kind of actual words we understand or even just real words at all, we replace real words with nonsense words. And then we kind of pretend they're real words and we wonder about whether it's a good argument or not. And when we put in these fake words, it helps us remove the distraction of our previous belief in the premises. So here, our previous beliefs about roses being beautiful can be a distractor for judging whether this argument is in fact logically valid. So if we take the same form, but we put instead nonsense words, it can be easier for us to assess the logical validity. So here, the two premises are that first, all snurgs are florgums. Second, all blurbs are florgums. So therefore, all snurgs are blurbs. But hopefully it's clear how this is not a valid argument, because again, it can be possible for snurgs and blurbs to be types of floor gums while still being two different groups of things. And so when we use these kind of nonsense words, it can be easier for us to decouple the assessment of the deductive validity of an argument from our prior beliefs.